Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second week of our collaborative film program with the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. The program is titled Decolonizing African Cinema, A History. I will leave the introductions to our core organizers, June Giovanni and Imru Bakari, but to give you some information about the program. The program is set to take place over 4 weeks. It started last week, with films made available to screen through the Africa Institute's website, starting 3 days before each webinar session. Today's session is titled Cinema Cultures in Africa, and we will be moderated by Pedro Pimenta. We had 2 films available for screening as part of this week's session. Ali Zawa, directed by Nabil Ayoush, and Mapansula by Oliver Schmitz. The webinar will last around an hour and a half. The format will include a 10 to 15-minute presentation by each guest speaker before turning into a discussion. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So for everyone attending, please write your questions in the Q&A section, and we hope to answer all your questions. I would just like to thank June Giovanni and Imru Bakari for this collaboration and all the support in organizing this program. I would also like to thank the team at the Africa Institute, Reem, Sharif, Lina, and Ahmed, and everyone else for their work and relentless efforts into making this happen. And a thank you to all film distributors and rights holders who have granted us permissions to screen the films. I'd like to pass it on to June to say a few words and introduce eventually the moderator. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Satan. Thank you also, Reem and Salah, for this possibility and for this collaboration. So the overall rationale of the webinar series is the African Institute, Sharjah, in collaboration with ourselves, the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. We present this film symposium program, Decolonizing African Cinema, A History. The JG PACA, which is a short version of the archive's name, welcomes this partnership as part of our vision, which is to help to inform ongoing debates and activity concerning the value and the use of audiovisual archives, particularly in relation to the study of African cinema. In this regard, we place a high value on deepening the archive's links with an institution such as the Africa Institute and with students of African cinema generally, and particularly on the continent of Africa. This webinar aims to reconsider the factors that have shaped the foundations of African cinema about cinema, of Africa about cinema, and to situate the seminal works in African cinema in relation to contemporary films and the trends and tendencies which have defined debates and critical ideas around this cinema. The purpose and the structure of this series, those have already been mentioned by Satan. So, and he's already indicated that there will be a series of films related to these. I'll pass over now to Imru, who will speak more about what is being addressed in the series.
Thank you, June. And again, welcome to all the participants, those of you who are here for the first time this week, and maybe hopefully those who are also present last week. This symposium is entitled Cinema Cultures in Africa. And in a sense, is concerned with the ways in which the moving image has been encountered and used by African peoples across the decades. From the perspective of the cultural experiences of audiences, there is underlying this discussion a recognition of the number of instances that historically frame, for example, the first representations of Africa and Africans in film from the beginning of cinema to colonial films, to the various national cinema movements, and importantly, to the present. At the core of this symposium, I think, is the complexity and the diversity of Africa. And the notion of national cinema is in a way being implicated here. Hence, the ideas of emerging or what emerged from colonialism into the post-independence era. And indeed, the central concerns that are, you might say, indicative of African filmmakers as cultural producers in relation to the historical ambiguities and challenges which they have faced. The discussants, as been noted, Jihan Altahari and Jude Akudinobi, they will be discussing various subjects, themes, ideas, and issues that might be related in one way or another to the films that we have provided as reference point, Ali Zawal and Mapansula. There is also a list for further viewing, which you can get from the Africa Institute website. Overall, I think we just need to note what frames this discussion in terms of 3 points. One, as I said, is the spread of cinema across the continent. The other is the significance of varying responses among audiences. And 3, the notable responses that could be regarded as efforts towards establishing what we would refer to as a self-determined African use of cinema. You've already had an idea of how the structure of the discussion would go. And we would have an introduction of the moderator in a few minutes, Pedro Pimenta, who will then introduce the discussants. And we will hope you will be involved for the discussion, open discussion from your questions and answers towards the end of the session. So June will now introduce Pedro Pimenta.
Well, thank you, Imru, and thank you all. It's great to be among colleagues and friends in this way. Pedro Pimenta started his film career with the National Film Institute of Mozambique in 1977. Since then, he has produced, co-produced, or line-produced numerous short fiction, documentaries, and feature films in his country, as well as in other African countries. Between 1997 and 2003, Pedro was the chief technical advisor of the UNESCO Zimbabwe Film and Video Training Project for Southern Africa in Harare. As part of his function, he conceived and managed various training programs. He is one of the founders of AVEA, the Audiovisual Entrepreneurs of Africa, which runs an annual professional training program for producers in Southern Africa. Until December 2005, Pedro was a member of the Prins Claus Fund Awards Committee of the Netherlands. He is founder and director of Kuxa Kanema, a documentary film festival in Mozambique. Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you. Thank you for having me for a start. And with no further ado, I will introduce our panelists today, which are Jihan Altahari. Jihan is a colleague and friend for many years, but this is not what's relevant here today. Jihan is a film director, Franco-Egyptian, and she has won enormous awards for her work over the years. But Jihan is also a writer, a visual artist, a producer, and an artistic director. She currently serves as a general director of the Berlin-based documentary support institution, Docsbox. Jihan has been a member of the Academy, the Oscars Academy, since 2017, and is currently on the selection committee of the Locarno International Film Festival. She has directed a long time, more than 15 films, and a visual art exhibition that have traveled to renowned museums and several biennales around the world. One can add into Jihan's CV writings that include Les 7 vies de Yasser Arafat, and Israel and the Arabs, the 50 Years War. Gian continues very actively to mentor and direct various documentary and filmmaking labs in the continent, and has served on the board of several African film organizations, including the Federation of Pan-African Cinema and the Guild of African Filmmakers in the diaspora. Thank you, Gian. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll pass on to introduce Jude Akudinobi, who earned his PhD in cinema television from the University of Southern California and teaches in the Department of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His works on African cinema have appeared in ARIS, The Black Scholar, Nka, Journal of Contemporary African Arts, Social Identities, Third Text, Research in African Literature, African Studies Review, Meridian, Cinema Journal, amongst other publications and anthologies. Jude is also a board member of Silicon Valley African Film Festival, African Film Consortium, as well as African Film and Arts Foundation. Dr. Akudinobi's research interest spans the complexities of cultural politics, post-colonial literatures, African diasporas, arts, popular culture, media, and cinema. Welcome, Jude. Thank you for joining us on this afternoon. And I will, I guess, kick off this conversation by asking Gian to provide us, as a way of an introduction, necessarily short, some relevant moments of the early origins of cinema in Africa, both in terms of colonial history, of experiencing cinema in the continent, but as well as in terms of a quite immediate appropriation of the medium by African as a tool for affirmation of their identities. Please, Gian, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I will try my best to be short, because you know me, I'm a bit of a chatterbox. So I think it's really interesting how we always and we continue to think of African cinema that is something that is being birthed. We keep saying the birth of African cinema, but actually cinema on the continent is as old as cinema ever existed, because Frères Lumière, after showing, literally 4 months after showing their first films, went to two spaces. They went in 1896, they went to Alexandria, and from there they went to Johannesburg. And in Alexandria, they basically showed they showed two films, but within a very short period of time, they started shooting films. 35 films, short films, were shot in Egypt with Egyptian technicians as early as 1896. And screenings in Johannesburg happened as early as 1897. So cinema isn't like a new introduction to the continent, but obviously the colonial framework of what how that developed, I think there are several points that one, just as background, needs to know. First of all, in the Francophone section of the colonial world, there was something as early as 1934 called le Décret Laval. And basically the Décret Laval forbid indigenous peoples to hold a camera, to portray their image, to do anything with image. So it's very important to understand this as a real obstacle that came into being. And the Decret Laval was not lifted until 1963. Now, in the Anglophone world, it was different. It wasn't by law, but obviously the cost. We can't forget that at the time, the cost of the reels, the cost of the machinery was not given to the indigenous population. So you do have a chunk, a period of time where imagery was very much restricted, the moving image, except, and that's what's really interesting and how it affects cinema cultures, except using the local population as technicians. So in the early 40s in Sudan, for example, you have someone like Jadallah Jabara who starts filming, but they're filming for the colonial administration. So I mean, I'm going to start from Egypt, not just because I'm Egyptian, but it's because I think there are two strands in how the film world develops. There's the propaganda strand, and there's the nationalist movement strands. And I think when we move on, we kind of course, they change shape, they change color, they change nature, but these two strands continue. So after the end of the colonial rule, you have independent film that more or less follows the nationalist strand, and you have the commercial that follows. I think what's important is to understand also the interconnections between that independent film strand and the rest of the continent, okay? Because starting in the 50s, the first studios that were actually even in competition with Hollywood studios at the time, we're talking the early 50s, where you had something like the Studio Masr that was producing major at the level of Hollywood films. Now, these studios, when they were nationalized, all the films and all the production became a kind of resource that Egypt was exporting to the rest of the continent. So a place like Senegal, for example, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and most of West Africa had Egyptian TV slots watching films. It was Thursday at 7, from the 60s all the way to 1975. Now, in the mid 70s, what happens on the entire continent is that there's a shift. We shift from the idea of film being part of what Amilcar Cabral and all the nationalist leaders wanted as part of the expression, as part of finding our own identity, finding our own voice, consolidating who we are as nations, that starts shifting to the cinema industry as a commercial enterprise. I mean, the mid-70s is the beginning of the heyday of capitalism. And in Egypt, what happens is that Sadat decides that all this exporting films is no longer a lucrative business. And so they stop it overnight. And in the rest of West Africa, to fill that slot, they moved into Bollywood films. And from Bollywood films, after Bollywood films, they moved into Nollywood films. So this progression actually does have a socio-economic logic to it. I don't want to rattle on for too long, but I think what I find really interesting is these bridges that have always existed, both visually, culturally, and in terms of the moving image as a key to how we define ourselves and see ourselves. And these moments of political instances that shift the nature of how we engage with the industry have affected our visual culture, have affected how we know each other. And so what has been happening over the past, I'll say 20 years, with this flourishing of platforms, co-productions, is a new move from South-South discourse to a kind of visual imagery that is more addressing the North. That is, how does this industry thrive as a commercial entity, rather than film being one of the major tools of post-colonial discourse and narrative to reconstitute who we are, how we connect together, and where is it we want to go.
Thank you, Gian. I'm sure we'll come back to that because there are plenty of matters to deal in what you just said. I think you established quite clearly the connection between East and West. We will come back in the connection that have been able to be established between North and South in the continent, because I believe that some of them are relevant to where we are today. Let me pass on to Dr. Jude and ask him to please give us your take and views on the idea of film cultures as established in this webinar within the socio-economic, historical, and political realities of the continent, and how, in your minds, these realities generate an impact on themes, thematics, and aesthetics choices of African film creators, and how these realities create a critical engagement towards certain social realities. Please, Jude.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Pedro, and thanks, Jihan, for establishing very profound foundations and critical foundations, really, for us to engage this rather diverse topic. I'll start with the process of decolonization itself. Decolonization is not a one instance, project. Certainly it's about sovereignty. It's about resistance. It's also about establishing, platforms, reference points through which one could express oneself artistically. And African cinema, as has been mentioned, from Jihan, had been right from the get-go involved in critical engagements of social realities. And in those, it's not really about a fantasticated, Africanness, but about subjecting those realities to critical engagements. And that is very, very important, because the connections there oftentimes bridge, heritage, history, and various other, intricate elements. But for them, it's not, again, about saying, oh, this is one Africa. Africa is intrinsically diverse, as well as the film styles, as well as the themes, as well as a host of other things that come with the process of decolonization. Because decolonization, it's about history, about its legacies. And most importantly, it has political, economic, psychological, cultural dimensions, and the various complex networks that these filmmakers have to engage. So those are very, very important. Now, with respect to African film cultures, because it's not, Africa is not one kind of place. With respect to African film cultures, we have to look then critically at the production, the distribution, the exhibition, and the various factors that, historically and over time, and even continually, let's say with the emergence of new technology, shape not just the production, but the reception of African, filmmaking. Much more so as for the African filmmakers, their priority was exploring the complex realities of Africa, not just, projecting. So if we talk about film cultures anyway, these film cultures also are shaped by multiple, and wide-ranging economic, social, political, cultural, historical contexts, But the point is this: it's not irreducible to one thing. Studies of African cinema in the past had framed it within Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone, and I don't want to, let's just say Arab or Maghrebi or Arabophone cinema, But I mean, these are just, I would say, a heuristic, frameworks, because such type of framing, of course, in some ways, have very, very critical gaps and silences about the network of exchanges, the areas of commonalities or even divergence within the practice of African cinema. So we have to be mindful that irrespective of where a film or filmmaker may have come from, their commitment to really excavating, put it that way, all this, more so as Africa and Africanness had been positioned peripherally, right from the era of, with the founding era of cinema, and up to the present, where it becomes, the site of explorations, of fantasies, and various other, I would rather say, dehumanizing projections, really, because, in those, Africans are peripheral characters. But with African cinema, nonetheless, Africans make Africans central characters. And it's very, very important because in there is this quest for voice, for agency, for self-affirmation and redefinition. So now, what happens? So you make your film, but at home too, because of the other legacies of colonialism, you find that African filmmakers don't even have the requisite support from the government, because a key also about film cultures would be the national film policies of the respective governments is very important. Whereas it might help in terms of opening up, other areas, and prospects for many others. There are also the rather ambiguous elements that could work with the sensorial. What type of films do you make? That is the personal and the institutional, sensorial, aspects. So with that, I'm mindful of the fact that African filmmakers have struggled. They will still not, and insofar as the audiences are very much, they have their focus on the indigenous audiences, the African audiences. We found that they don't get to play much in the theaters. Most of those theaters also, as part of the vestiges of, colonization, or some people would say cultural imperialism, are basically washed with, fluffy movies from other dominant cinemas. And so they have to contend, with those. And with African, film cultures, festivals are very, very important. FESPACO just concluded, and it wasn't just about, yippee, here we go. It's really foundational to, again, exploring the various facets of African cinema itself, and most importantly, establishing, platforms for critical reflections. So when we have festivals now, blooming, really quite a number have sprung up over the times in Africa and abroad, some of which I belong to, and so I mean plenty could be said, but let me stop there for now, and we'll take it off from there. Thank you very much again, Pedro, Jihan, June, Stan, everybody. Really, this is a very, very robust and vibrant atmosphere for us to, thank you.
There is an area that I would like to throw at both of you, which is obviously related to my producer's act, which has to do, and I'm doing a huge jump here, which has to do with the existing funding models of the diverse African cinemas we can think of. Would you be able to assist us in establishing correlations between these various funding models, their impact on content being produced in Africa, and are you finding direct correlation between different funding models and different kinds of expression? I think this is a matter of importance for us to think of, so that over the years, we are not victims of funding models, but along the way, we are always aware that it's very important to keep certain aspects, certain choices, which are part of an history and which are not necessarily dominant at a certain stage, but are foundational to what we call African cinemas. So I would like both of Gian and Jude to elaborate a bit on that, so that we've got an understanding of your sensibility about it.
If you don't mind, I'll start actually, because it kind of allows me to say a couple of things that I wanted to elaborate in terms of what Jude was saying. I think the context of how the local institutions post-independence were structured and how they saw the cinema as part of the toolkit they had to move forward is really important. And I think just very symbolically, the ministry in Egypt that was responsible for cinema was called the Ministry of National Guidance. And I think that says more than, I don't need to elaborate on that. And I think that also gives the mindset in terms of the shift from the need to go from identity to the need of this kind of nationalist move, and how little by little this fades away, okay? And to elaborate on that, you have a seminal film that I think combines all these ideas together, which is the Battle of Algiers. The Battle of Algiers in 1963, basically, I mean, post-1963, basically has a new model. It was funded locally. First film to be 100% funded locally. The script was written by someone who was a mujahid, yet it was directed by an Italian. But what is really important about this film and why it remains such a model is because this film captured, in many ways, a common reality that everybody felt that it could be in Algiers, but this is our story too. And we move on from there. Just one small thing to say, to add on to what Jude was saying. Language and representation is the reason why we think of Sam Ben Osman as the father of African cinema, although he wasn't. I mean, let's be clear. There were many films before Sam Ben came, and some men made his film. But why is he considered that? Because a film like La Noire d'Eux was the very first time this dignity of this is who we are, this is what we represent, you can humiliate me as much as you want, but my dignity remains intact. And then you had Mandabe, which was the very first film ever, and he battled for that, to be shot entirely in Wolof. And I think these two elements take us a step further in terms of historically where we put our foot down and start calling ourselves African cinema. Now, to come to funding models, I think the 70s and the 80s, and I'll say more the 80s, the coming, I mean, it's in my lifetime. I remember my first film, a number of my first films, you produced with the money that was either local or that was commissioned by something, but it was one person. And you either fought for your idea, they accepted it, or they didn't accept it. And suddenly in the 80s, you have this concept of co-production. And concept of co-production basically means that you've got to please everyone, because no one's going to put money in your film anymore. So we get to this dilution of this word universal. I'm not criticizing all of this because, I mean, it happened. But the truth is, it happened, and it always at the beginning seems like a great idea because it gives us more leeway. But with time, it becomes a part of the infrastructure. In the past, you could choose to be part of a co-production or not. Today, if you're not part of a co-production, you can't make your film, okay? And that's where the danger of new technology and the platform comes. Today, something like Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, all these new platforms, they have the kind of money any filmmaker wants to say, okay, let me just do this with them and I'll make my film the way I want it. But then we can see visually, our own visual culture is being transformed by the way stories are seen to be best told by an external, someone who is paid by an external funder. I mean, let's call, as the French would say, let's call the Shah a Shah. So nowadays, and I was saying this the other day, nowadays, every single African film even starts with a drone shot and is filmed in 4K. What does that have to do with our reality? Why is that a transmission of the aesthetic of the stories that we're dealing with? It's not. We have to play the game in order to jump onto the bandwagon of the global narrative. And within that global narrative, we and our exploration that we had barely started is being erased. Our diversity is being erased. And I think that's a big shame.
Thank you, Gian. Jude, would you like to add on that?
Just briefly, first, she raised very important issues because there is, with themes, of course, how you tell a story is just as important as the story being told. You know, it's all not just about aesthetics. It could also be very, very ideologically motivated, you know, in terms of how the audiences are positioned. And I mean audiences in a very, very diverse, you know, way. And we all know that African cinema had always been really an independent cinema, where people had to struggle, you know, for years after one film to get another, cobble together resources here and there and make the best. And if you think of, you know, let's say Jibril Mambeti Diop's Hyenas, that is very, very important, you know, not just about his own, you know, artistic, you know, projects, but how some people would say, oh, how did you adapt a foreign story? You know, but that process of adaptation is about repositioning, reinterpreting it and juxtaposing that with very, very important realities. So our reference points have to go beyond, the very, very, would I say, self-comforting or myopic. But that said, co-production is not easy. Anyway, one of my friends would say the golden rule is not about the propriety of the other. The golden rule is he or she who has the gold rules, and inevitably, with cinema, with filmmaking, money is involved. However, in that process, we also have to factor in, the national identities, the tensions, the economies, the ideologies, the leanings, and various other, intricate, element in the mix that may shape a profound or verdant, platform for national or transnational exchanges, but could down the line compromise the values and priorities of African artistic expressions. So insofar as people would see, African cinema as a cinema of the art circuit, for instance, okay, a cinema that gets maybe, trophies or recognition elsewhere, we have to be mindful that distinction between a critical success and a commercial success. There are two different things. And with Nollywood, for instance, in Nigeria, its start and even trajectories have opened up various complex, some people would say even problematic aspects about this, process and project for self-determination, representation, and all that. But it was basically done outside of government, help or support. But currently the government has realizing, the importance, which is where I would really appeal to the African government, that cultural production is intrinsically part of their social realities. If you look at, let's say the contribution of the Hollywood industry to the American world, then you see the prospects, not just in terms of the transnational exchanges, but the need to build requisite infrastructures, be there with production, training, exhibition, and ways that, again, will, converge within that, framework of sovereignty. In other words, where African, artists, filmmakers, even the hospitality industries that would come from filmmaking, because filmmaking is not just one thing. Back in those days, the African filmmaker would shoot a film, maybe go to Paris or somewhere to develop it, edit, and that. These days, with technology, of course, anybody can pick up a film and, make a film and do that. And so with Nollywood, much as it has shown that, look, there are indeed prospects, commercial prospects, for a sustaining, development of African cinema. They weren't so much primed on perfection. And don't forget that we had, the manifestos of third cinema that talks about the cinema of imperfection, and they don't have to be, because even though lately there has been this push for professionalism, for polish and all that, well, those elements, are not, would I say, intrinsic. They have certain, like, Jahan had mentioned, when you project or pitch, your film, to a producer or a studio, even here in Hollywood, sometimes it could end up in what they call development hell. It just stays there for so long and never get made. But even if a film is made, also, how it's positioned within diverse communities could come from trailers, from posters, and all that are very important. So the hierarchization of values or principles or even race becomes very, very important if we look at, this process of decolonization and its richly, richly diverse and complex, paradoxes, particularly in this era of new technology where somebody could watch a film, from a cell phone or shoot with a cell phone and all that. So I'll stop there for now. And
Pedro, if you'll allow me, just
please
two
go ahead.
words.
Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Jibril's hyena, because I mean, that's a perfect example of between Tukibuki and hyena. It took him like, I can't remember if it was 11 or 17 years to raise the money to make that film. Okay. And I think that's a very important example, because it does not matter. And I'm talking with my film director's hat, okay? Doesn't matter how many successes you've had. It doesn't matter how you have been well received. Somehow on the continent, you start from scratch each and every time. And it's really important to also recognize that our films, no matter how good they are, they have to be recognized abroad first for you to be able to be recognized internally. Why that is, I have no idea. But that outward, inward movement is a constant. And Nollywood is maybe a different case, but other than people like Tunde Kelani or the big names in Nollywood, they're just films, and the director and the maker of it, it becomes a machine, a factory. So there are one or two or three known figures in Nollywood, but I'll stick to the kind of independent scene. I think our own countries are maybe starting to wake up, okay? Because you have something like Senegal, the creation of FOPECA was in many ways, it was thanks to the success of Alain Gomis internationally, not locally, okay? Now, why is Hollywood regarded as the example we should follow? Still beyond me. I don't think it's an example we should follow. And what it turns out in money does not necessarily filter down to the industry itself or to the economy itself. It filters down to the star system. Now, what is happening on the continent, and everybody's involved in that, we have become a kind of factory of first and second time filmmakers. Nobody anymore has a body of work. No filmmaker, no matter how hard they work, no matter how good they are, now, very few can go beyond their third film, because the funding system internally, regionally, and internationally say, let's turn out young people. Now, after the second film, so we have this plethora of filmmakers, and 90% of them can't make a third film. So we no longer have a narrative. We can watch some Ben's films, and we have a narrative from the 60s to the 2000s. We can watch Yusuf Shaheen's films, and we can have this narrative. Through these films, we have a reflection on society, a clear idea of the shifting, the issues of societies. We don't have this anymore, because every single stream of funding goes to first or second time filmmakers, and then they're thrown in the bin. And I think that is a serious problem.
And may I also add, just like what she said, if we draw parallels between funding and the NGOs and the relationship to Africa, you begin to see, because the NGOs, yeah, they do good as ostensibly, but they put money where basically their interests are most served. And so if you get funding and do what you want to do outside of their preferences or whatever priorities, chances are that you may never get any funding again. It's just in the nature of things. So I would, suggest that, transnational corporations, the festivals, co-productions, and truth be told, one may never need to have, such a budget, because the budget for African filmmaking is really very marginal if you consider, let's say, the blockbuster Hollywood types and things like that. But if anything, it shows the resilience, the creativity, of African filmmaking, and the fact, again, from those manifestos of the third cinema, that truth be told, you do not have to have $100 million, dollar budget to make a very, good. We are good itself is even a problematic, term. What is good? Commercial. Oh yeah, yippee! Everybody came, they clapped at the festival. So what? Do you get to exhibit your films? What kind of, are you alienating? Because and it's very important in this instance that one of the films we are supposed, out there we're supposed to see for this, Mapansula, there is this reflexive moment of a theater where people are watching, a film. I said, wow, this is really good. And I looked somewhere outside, and the title was, the poster was Below the Hell or something, below hell or hell below and things like that. But it's, if we see the screens as alienating, then of course, African filmmakers, insofar as they did not see themselves, in those screens or on those screens, except as magical, characters or objects of fun, who are fetishized for their or their anthropological, whatever they could bring. So it's very, very complex anyway. And I'll zip my mouth for now. Okay.
I think we're getting, thank you, Jude. This very interesting debate. We could continue forever, but I think we've got restriction and sometimes should be allocated to Q&A. And I have some interventions here. One of them saying, Gian asked how drone shots and 4K cameras are part of reality in Africa. As tools of technology, can't they be considered tools to better present the realities we live in, rather than tools that are part of our reality? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, should I answer? I'll answer that since it's addressed to me. I'm not ticking them off completely. What I'm trying to say is that there is a certain formatting of the aesthetic that has become extremely recurrent. A drone shot from above showing a scene could be very important to get an idea. But when every film starts with a drone shot, just to have a drone shot, because that's what is in at the moment. It kind of reminds me in the late 90s when the MTV mode was on, when it was really out of fashion to have a shot that was like standard, and all the shots had to be sort of sideways, and that was what was in fashion. So to respond to drone shots, yes, they have their use, and the use of drone. And by the way, most of our countries are not allowed drone shots because the military doesn't allow them.
Very complicated.
FYI. So yes, drones are interesting, but when they become part of a formatting, that becomes a problem. As for 4K, 4K is great, but you can only use 4K if you watch it on 4K TV. Tell me which country on the continent has 4K TV. So why is it that filmmakers have to spend that much money, double their budget, and do this for a very wonderfully the image, when we cannot use it? We do not have 4K TVs. And plus, I'll add on to that, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be used. All I'm saying that we have to contextualize the technology and how we use it and why we use it for our own purposes. So when you're doing a film that is happening 600 miles from the capital in a country where the capital itself is very underdeveloped. When you have this perfect, clean 4K shot, I'm not sure it actually does any advantage to the film, because it's not the context in which, nor the visual, nor the texture of what the film is talking about. So that's my answer to that. I'm not excluding the importance, or it's the formatting and it's dancing to a tune that might not always be ours, is what I'm saying.
Thank you, Gian. I'll go back a little bit, because both mentioned the relationship with audiences and the various ways it happens or not. African audiences for African cinemas. Festivals were mentioned as a very important platform for African cinema. We mentioned platforms, distribution platforms. But we also mentioned, I think Gian mentioned that, a plethora of young filmmakers in a market full of energy and dynamism, wanting to express something. The difficult question, I think, for all of us is, what's the way forward with all this? I mean, how do we filter something so that beside the gatekeepers and in front of the avalanche of the views, how do we find some kind of a balance that ensure that the cinema which is produced reflects some sense of a reality? I totally agree with Gian that the very clean, neat shot, far away from anything similar to that, sounds to me a project that have been workshopped too much by too many people. So we just play safe. Everybody will be satisfied by the end result. Where is the imperfection of our realities? How do we bring it back as a value, not as something which is bad, but as a criteria to analyze critically what we do? What would you say?
I would say we just need to recognize ourselves in our films. And I think the huge danger of Orientalism, as Edward Said put it, is really at our doorstep. Because the more we move on, the more we actually have more skills, more knowledge, more technology, more means, the more we are getting rid of our own voice and our own diversity in order to join to join the crowd, to join, we want to be one of them. And seeing ourselves through that prism, I think is impoverishing us. I think our diversity is absolutely amazing. Every time I get a new script, I say, oh my God, I didn't even know that existed. Oh my God, I didn't even know that place existed. There's so many stories for us to tell. And what do we end up with in film festivals, to get back in film festivals? The same films that did the round. You'll find a film that goes to Berlinale in February. It'll be the only film that goes from festival to festival, including African film festivals. What about all the rest? What about, and I think that there's a certain, and I'm not condemning, there's the system, the machine has been put in place where it is impoverishing us. It is not allowing us the daring of exploration. It is not allowing us different ways of telling the story, lovely, perfect, linear, four-act structures. We know that that's how you make the film, tick the boxes, there you go. Off
Buy the book, buy the book, buy the book.
Enough, enough. We're from a continent that does nothing but tell stories. Why can't we tell stories in our own way? And just so I can respond and promise to shut up after that, to what can we do? I think there are many things we can do. First of all, given technology, what are the platforms that we can provide in order for these films to have their own economies? They don't have to follow the alternative economies. Don't forget that co-productions have these massive budgets. You can't do a documentary with less than 250,000 if you're doing a co-production. The question is why? The why is because 55% of your budget goes to social charges in the Western country. So it's not coming into your film. It's going right there. So why don't we invert this? Secondly, our countries have to believe in us. They absolutely have to believe in us. They have to bank on us. Voila.
Thank you, Gian. Do we still have time? Yes, I guess so. Jude, you mentioned film festivals as a kind of transnational cooperation. Can you speak to your experience about the limitation and possibilities of transnational exchange in creating and curating an image of Africa through its programming?
Well, I mean, film festivals at least are arguably intrinsic to, African film cultures, because not only were African, cinema or films excluded, from the exhibition circuits, even abroad, they had specialist exhibition, circuits too. The art houses where they could play for 3 weeks, everybody claps and is yanked off, and if you're lucky, you might get a, DVD or whatever, and all that. But the festivals that I am affiliated with, and that I know, like the Silicon Valley African Film Festival, the New York African Film Festival by Mahembo Heneti, I mean, they are unapologetic about their Africanness, which is very, very important. And the diaspora, now becomes a very, very critical factor, because the diaspora is not just about origins, it's about heritage. It's like, the Sankofa bird, it looks, backwards, what flies forward, and all those things. So there, with new cultural formations, with the new generations of filmmakers, with new audiences, and given that each festival is just as different from the other, it's just in the nature of things. Each festival discovers new audiences to start with. They do not, replay the same films. And even if they have retrospective, elements, it juxtaposes, those past to the present, thereby opening up new windows very, very complexly to others who may not, have seen it so. And yes, festivals are also important insofar as they've been picked. Sometimes films are picked for distribution from there and all that. Now, with respect to the rather, there was an incident in the past with the Toronto Film Festival where the African filmmakers said, no, we don't want Planet Africa. That just kind of putting us in some kind of a pigeonhole. We want to be put, or mixed with others. Now, reasonable minds, of course, would differ, in terms of the really practical aspects of that. But to have a unique platform where Africanness is shown, Africanness is programmed, Africanness is not even, hoping to get, oh, I was called to the table, and it doesn't matter if I'm put somewhere, behind somebody. No, they became central, really, to the inspiration of not just the audiences to different ways of seeing, again, because each film festival and the practicalities, and I mean, there are various issues with, let's say, curatorship, there. But it's not about romanticizing Africa or even fostering an essentialist Africanness. It's not so. For the new generation of African, filmmakers, I think most, frankly, are, courageous in opening up new spaces, or even overlooked peoples or narratives, or the gaps and silences in, African, filmmaking. Okay. I'm sure we know about the ruffle that Rafiki, started in Kenya with Wanuri Kahi, whom I knew when she was a student here at UCLA, So, and various others. The point is this, that the critical foundations and challenges of African cinema privileges self-expression, privileges that, would I say, not even commercialization or commercialism or whatever, but ways through which new windows or angles could, be used to frame or at least engage the complexities of Africa itself and Africanness without compromise, or at least manifest compromise or compromises, because you hardly ever won, to the dominant cinemas or the people that hold, yeah.
Okay, I've got here from the Q&A a question related to something recent. Basically, it says, UNESCO is currently procuring African stories with no regard to intellectual property. The question is there any regulation to protect our native narratives against cultural appropriation? We would like to jump on that.
If you allow me to just say something in reaction to Jude and the African film festivals, I think it's at least it's very important for me, and I know quite a few of us. It's obviously very important to have African film festivals and to have the space in order to have your own space. It's a kind of an affirmative action in a way, okay? And we cannot pretend that, okay, we're coming out of colonialism and we're gonna start exactly where everybody is right now. We need the space, we need the time, we need the time to catch up. So African film festivals are an affirmative action, are a good thing. But to keep us in the ghetto and say, that's the only space. Now that you have that space, why do you want to come play ball with us? That is unacceptable. So I think it's this distinction. The fact that there's a lot of money being pumped in African film festivals is very good, but it also is excluding the African voice from just film festivals. It's exactly like people telling me as a female director, well, why can't I just be a director? My gender is important, my nationality, my identity is important, but why should it be my defining factor? So that's one thing. And to get to the UNESCO, the narratives, the native narratives and cultural appropriation, I'm not sure I understand what native narratives are. Because again, and that goes very much with what I'm trying to say. If we want to put ourselves in a glass box and to be looked at as oh, look at these natives, look at their narratives. I think the time of all this is a bygone age. We have stories like everybody else has stories. You mentioned Wanuri's film, Jude. Wanuri's film is an amazing film, okay, that addresses part of a young population, but alienates a huge other part, because it's a narrative that they are not sure how this connects to them. We're never, ever going to please anybody. A filmmaker, basically, what they do is that they tell one story they are keen to tell. And I think if you put on a filmmaker's shoulders more than that, one, it's not fair and it's undoable. And every one of us, their little bit of the story is like a brick in the wall. And we're trying to construct this wall together. What will this wall look like? And cultural appropriation, to get back to the question, native narratives, well, a cultural appropriation. Isn't culture something we want to share? If somebody wants to address something, we're going to like it, dislike it, critique it, diss it, ban it, do whatever we want with it. But but of course, this is my own point of view. This whole introduction of politically correct and all these labels that come from God knows where, actually we do know where, come from across the ocean. I'm sitting here in Dakar. Talk to anyone in the street and talk to them about cultural appropriation. They won't even know what I'm talking about. You're living something, you have a story to tell, you engage with it, people criticize you, think you're racist, think you're this. We need to be in dialogue. Who is allowed to talk, who isn't allowed to talk is something that comes from the NGO culture that has been put on us. The themes we address and which themes are being financed is what comes from over there. What is appropriate and not appropriate shifts by, I don't know, should we give it 2 years, 3 years, and then it's not appropriate anymore? Maybe it's because I'm an old hag and I'm 58, so I've been through all these movements, and I keep telling myself, am I allowed to say that? Am I not allowed to say that? Is that how you say it? And then at some point, I'm just a filmmaker. I have a story to tell, and this is how I'm going to tell it. If I'm shot down, well, I'm shot down.
May I say something, Pedro?
Go ahead, Jude. Go ahead.
Okay. With African cinema, definitely, we have continuities and breaks. Oftentimes Africanness is seen more like a static pool, but we know that all societies are dynamic, and dynamic means, changes. So with new generations, of course, there are new reference points and inevitably, priorities. And whether we may like, just like when I teach, I'll tell the students, look, you don't have to like this film. If it makes you cry, fine. If it makes you laugh, whatever, the point is you have to engage those films on their own terms. It's just in the nature of things. So when we know that, the peripheral positioning of African cultural production in the larger discourse, of course, but lately, yes, there have been affirmations, oh, this is a world heritage and all that and that and that. We have to be mindful of such, and the ambiguities, of course, are inherent, and not everybody would be on board, either for the same reasons or at the same time. But with respect to the festivals anyhow, why I know, and everybody here knows, that in the past, it had been, particularly in the major festivals, as sidebars, and some would argue that, oh, this is the same voyeuristic, trend that had always been, related to Africanness in the dominant imaginaries. So if we have people who are of African, the diaspora and African heritage of sorts, the networks, and their commitment to at least providing alternative spaces to engage the complexities, not just of cultural production, but with respect, to film and filmmaking, mindful of the histories within the continent, and mindful as well in their respective places of newer generations, My thing would be this, that the borders which had previously put African cinema within the circuit of art house or whatever have to be somewhat dismantled. And as you well know, the virus has to get in the system to really wreak havoc. So, sometimes, so when they have those, when we have these festivals outside, when we have the film cultures that are intrinsically intertwined, really, it is important then for the African filmmaker, of course, not in ways that would undermine the artistic independence, either through government funding or through nationalist, funding too, because there are two different things. We have to make a distinction between the national cinemas and nationalist, cinemas. One, the nationalists would be more of the regulation, the issue of propriety, the questions of autonomy, which had been, foundational to, African filmmaking. They said, look, we want to be free. We want to, express ourselves, our liberties, and however, whatever ruffles it may cause or, that, so shall it be. But, African cinema, nonetheless, is still lodged between those limited commercial, avenues and the markets and the audiences. But nonetheless, yes, the audiences are very, very critical. Right now, I caught word of a Pan-African Film Festival holding in Dubai, shortly. African Film Festival is all over the place, and there is one in Australia, founded by an African, and he's not apologetic about his Africanness, nor are these other festival directors. Each edition of a festival is different. They pose different challenges because they have to put together, and these are non-profits, organizations, piece together their, little funding and work for the betterment of, all and the continent. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Gian, we have got a question from the audience directed to you. You talk about the shift between the 70s and 80s with a shift from anti-colonial resistance to attempting to compete in the global cinema landscape. How does all this fit in with the struggle of a non-aligned movement in this period, especially around the New World Information and Communication Order and the rise and fall of these struggles in the same period?
I think that the whole non-aligned world and
that was a period.
That question should have come like 20 minutes ago. But now that we're reaching the end, I'm not quite sure how far to delve into this. But just to say that the non-aligned movement was a real platform of widening the scope. And don't forget that Russia, Japan were part of the non-aligned movement. We think that it's just the South. The non-aligned movement, even from Bandung to 1955 and then 1963 in Yugoslavia, the non-aligned movement was a creation of a whole alternative infrastructure and space, a new space of interconnections. However, unfortunately, that was given a serious knock towards the end of the 60s. Many things, I mean, between 66 and 1970, and I'll stick to the continent, there were many blows. 66, you had Nkrumah was ousted. Most of the founding fathers of independence were out. So that vision of interconnectedness was undermined. So Modibo Keita in Mali, Nkrumah, and then you had the 67 war, so the entire North Africa was knocked out. So the late 60s, and then the recurrence of coup d'etats where you didn't quite know who was, there was no stability. So when the 70s comes and a new format of governance, which is not only based on that vision of Pan-Africanism. I'm not saying Pan-Africanism left, because Pan-Africanism is a process, but it was part of the first vision of how to move on, okay? The 70s was about how to become industries, how to satisfy audiences rather than say what it is you want to say. So that moment of reflection, that moment of accounting. I mean, we got out of the colonial moment without stopping and thinking what just happened to us. And I think just, I'm going to say last word because I know we're going to run out of time. We have run out of time. Somebody asked about diasporas. I think this is really, really key. In the coming 10, 20 years, when we say Africa, what does African look like? Who is African? When we look at the immigration crisis, if you want to call it crisis, the number of young people, the thousands, the hundreds of thousands that are moving outside Africa, have they stopped being African? Their children who are mixed race, have they stopped being African? What shade of skin does African start with and where does it stop? I think these are questions that we might not be addressing today, but in the future, when we talk about Africa, what does this Africa look like? The diaspora has been absolutely key in all these changes, all these attempts to come back, because us in the diaspora, and I'm one of the diaspora, we become more African the moment we're out of our homes because we need it. It's our only anchorage. And that desire to come back is really part of that dynamo that labs, all these things are starting with. So this bridge between outside, inside is not two different people. It's the same people that need that bridge to go back and forth.
Thank you, Gian. We are running out of time, it seems. We are getting to an end. Probably a last question to address to Jude from one member of the audience. Can you comment on an African network like Ebony Life? Are these different from the international networks you mentioned earlier, like Netflix? What would you say, Jude?
Well, I mean, the thing is this, one is an indigenous, enterprise, and certainly African cinema, and inevitably has to, engage those transnational, be they ideological, economic, cultural, currents, but insofar as, Ebony Life really also is very important because Jihan mentioned gender, founded by an African woman, who has had that foreign experiences and is very much key to opening up, Africanness to different ways of being and seeing. So the content of such should not just be, its value wouldn't just be about the content or the theme or the characters or whatever there. In the same way as African cinema must not be boiled down to aesthetics or be it political, but even engage in the politics of representation. So with Ebony Life, with the festivals, I would see those as interventions, really, within the distribution, or at least, the charged, networks through which, Africanness is, circulated in the dominant, imaginary. If nothing else, they would even help blur those boundaries between, you know, let's say the public or the, I mean, on and on and on. Long and short of it is this, that there are attempts to establish, you know, dialogues, needful dialogues, also mindful of the trajectories of, you know, the contemporary audiences, you know, for whom, you know, the past is just as important as well as their imminent, you know, realities. So whether it be, you know, government policies that support such, or whether it be just some kind of entrepreneurial, you know, venture, the standpoints there basically are argued, let's say with, you know, Ebony Life, in resistance and empowerment. And yes, questions and context are, yes, you know, also part of it, but lived experiences, certain realities, you know, and bridging certain boundaries would not necessarily mean blotting out the specificities, you know, of those, you know, instances, you know, engender, or at least quest, you know, for such, you know, there.
Thank you. I guess we have to stop here. We reach our time. So I want to thank our panelists, Gian Eltadi and Jude Akudinobi, for your clarity in bringing up a lot of very interesting subject. I want to thank the African Institute for bringing this together. And I will hand this back over to the organizers, Satan, June, and Imru. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Jihan. Thank you, Jude, again. A very lively discussion, very important discussion, particularly if we reflect, and I hope those who were here last week, accumulatively reflecting on the week before and what has gone before. You've raised some very important questions, and you've sort of explored, if not given answers, at least directions towards answers, where we might open up new perspectives about historicizing of this experience of cinema in Africa, or the African experience of cinema. It's important that you included at the end the dimension of the diaspora and what would be called in some ways the African global world. Just before we thank everybody, we'd like to thank you again, thank our participants. And I would say, I just want to pick up one comment from the chat, which is probably something we'll pick up on later. It's about the manifestos and the kind of declarations that African filmmakers have over the years proposed towards, you know, a sort of policy. The idea of policy came up earlier, and the role that governments and national structures, institutions might play, should play in creating these conditions, whether national, regional, or global, in fact. So that question is taken as a very important point going forward. We are aware of it. There have been many, in fact, and there are publications where some of these, a lot of these, in fact, are collected, and we can, you can find them online. Just typing. I can't remember the book that's edited with manifestos. There are a lot of manifestos because African filmmakers are not the only ones who've made manifestos. You know, Third Cinema, Latin Americans, etc. So there, a lot of them are collected. You wanted to say something, Gian?
Scott McKinsey.
Scott McKinsey, that's the name. That's one of the names, yes, definitely. And of the FEPACI and FESPACO publications as well. So those are some things going forward. So thank you very much for those comments and engagements in the chat. June?
Yes.
Giovanni.
Thank you. Thank you also. You've said everything that I wanted to say. Obviously, I have a long history in terms of the diaspora presentation, the diaspora film exhibition circuits, including Planet Africa and others. And so a lot of the discussion has been very close to, and as curators, we're continually very close to all of these debates and negotiating them in every aspect. I found it a very rich discussion. And I would like to personally also thank you all, the panelists. I hope that you will be engaged in some way in the rest of it going forward. Please do come on and engage with us. And I thank you very much, Pedro, for this. Jude, Jihan, my friends, my big sister, and also the African Institute for this collaboration so that we can do this. And I hand over to Satan to say something.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Thank you all again. June and Emru said everything that needs to be said, but thank you all, Pedro, Jihan, and Jude. It was a very engaging conversation, clearly from all the questions that came in from the audiences. We wish we had more time to answer everything, but I just wanted to say for next week's session, we have another session next week, starting on the 4th with screening of films until the 6th. And on the 6th of November, we will have Associate Professor Abu Bakr Sanogo moderating a discussion between Keith Sheary and Mahen Bonetti. The title of the webinar is Historicizing the African Cinema.
The decolonizing principle.
Historicizing the decolonizing principle, yes. Well, thank you for that, June. And yes.
Great.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.